This video explores the psychology of chronic overthinkers, people whose minds never stop racing. You'll learn how overthinking isn't a personality flaw but a survival strategy developed in childhood, often from unpredictable environments or inconsistent attachment. The video explains the neuroscience behind hypervigilance, how it affects relationships in daily life, and why thinking can't actually create the safety we're seeking. Most importantly, you'll discover that healing doesn't come from thinking more or understanding better. It comes from learning to feel instead of analyze, to be present instead of constantly preparing, and to recognize that you are always enough without needing to think your way into deserving peace. Have you ever noticed that some people never seem to stop? Not physically, they might sit perfectly still, but mentally, their minds are always running, always processing, always several steps ahead or several layers deep into something that happened 3 years ago. You can see it in their eyes sometimes. That distant look, that quiet intensity. They're present, but they're also somewhere else entirely. And if you ask them what they're thinking about, they'll pause, smile a little, and say nothing or just stuff, because the truth is too layered, too complex, too exhausting to explain. But here's what they won't tell you. They're thinking about everything. They're analyzing the tone of a text message from this morning. They're replaying a conversation from last week, searching for hidden meanings. They're planning tomorrow, next month, 5 years from now. They're solving problems that don't exist yet. They're creating scenarios, testing outcomes, preparing for disasters that will probably never happen. And underneath all of that noise, underneath all of that mental motion, there's a question that never quite goes away. A question that drives the endless thinking. A question that sounds something like this. Am I safe? Am I okay? Am I enough? This video explores the psychology of chronic overthinkers, people whose minds never stop racing. You'll learn how overthinking isn't a personality flaw but a survival strategy developed in childhood, often from unpredictable environments or inconsistent attachment. The video explains the neuroscience behind hypervigilance, how it affects relationships in daily life, and why thinking can't actually create the safety we're seeking. Most importantly, you'll discover that healing doesn't come from thinking more or understanding better. It comes from learning to feel instead of analyze, to be present instead of constantly preparing, and to recognize that you are always enough without needing to think your way into deserving peace. Have you ever noticed that some people never seem to stop? Their minds are always running, always processing, always several steps ahead or several layers deep into something that happened 3 years ago. You can see it in their eyes sometimes. That distant look, that quiet intensity. They're present, but they're also somewhere else entirely. And if you ask them what they're thinking about, they'll pause, smile a little, and say nothing or just stuff, because the truth is too layered, too complex, too exhausting to explain. But here's what they won't tell you. They're thinking about everything. They're analyzing the tone of a text message from this morning. They're replaying a conversation from last week, searching for hidden meanings. They're planning tomorrow, next month, 5 years from now. They're solving problems that don't exist yet. They're creating scenarios, testing outcomes, preparing for disasters that will probably never happen. And underneath all of that noise, underneath all of that mental motion, there's a question that never quite goes away. A question that drives the endless thinking. A question that sounds something like this. Am I safe? Am I okay? Am I enough? Let me tell you something about people who can't stop thinking. They didn't choose this. This wasn't a personality trait they selected from a menu of options. This was a survival strategy. Somewhere, usually early in life, their environment taught them that awareness equals safety. That if they could just think hard enough, predict well enough, control carefully enough, they could prevent bad things from happening. Maybe they grew up in a home where emotional weather changed without warning, where a parent's mood could shift in an instant, and the only way to stay safe was to read the room obsessively, to track every micro-expression, to become an expert in emotional forecasting. Or maybe they experienced something that shattered their sense of security or loss. A betrayal, a moment where the world revealed itself to be less stable than they'd believed. And in that moment, their brain made a decision. It said, never again. Never again will I be caught off guard. Never again will I fail to see it coming. From that point forward, thinking became armor. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. It is a state of heightened sensory sensitivity and intense awareness that is typically associated with trauma or chronic stress. When your brain perceives threat, real or imagined, it activates your sympathetic nervous system, flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline. Your senses sharpen. Your mind races. You become exquisitely attuned to everything around you and everything within you. This is useful if you're actually in danger. If a tiger is chasing you, you want your brain working overtime. But here's the problem. For people who can't stop thinking, the tiger never leaves. The threat becomes internalized. Your own thoughts become the danger you're trying to outthink. Research in neuroscience shows that chronic hypervigilance actually changes brain structure. A study published in the Journal of Neuroscience found that prolonged stress and overactive thinking patterns increase activity in the amygdala, your brain's fear center, while simultaneously decreasing activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thought and emotional regulation. In other words, the more you think, the harder it becomes to think clearly. Your brain gets stuck in a loop. Threat detection mode becomes your default setting, and rest becomes impossible because rest feels like vulnerability. But there's another layer to this. Another reason why some people can't stop thinking, and it has to do with something called anxious attachment. Psychologist John Bowlby's attachment theory explains that the relationships we form in childhood, particularly with our primary caregivers, shape how we relate to the world as adults. If your early attachments were inconsistent, if love felt conditional, if you learned that connection required constant effort and perfect performance, your brain developed a template. It learned that safety isn't guaranteed, that people leave, that love can be withdrawn. And so you became vigilant not just about external threats, but about relational ones. You learned to overthink every interaction, to analyze every word, every silence, every shift in energy. You learned that if you could just figure people out, if you could just anticipate their needs and manage their emotions, you could keep them close. You could prevent abandonment. This is why people who can't stop thinking often struggle deeply in relationships, not because they don't care, but because they care so intensely that it becomes overwhelming. They're running dozens of simulations in their mind. They're reading between lines that might not even exist. They're re-looking for signs of rejection before rejection happens so they can either prevent it or brace for impact. Now, let's talk about what this actually looks like in daily life. Because the thing about chronic overthinking is that it's invisible. From the outside, these people often appear incredibly capable, intelligent together. They're the ones who remember everything, who think ahead, who solve problems before anyone else even notices there's a problem. But inside, it's chaos. It's exhausting. It's like running a marathon that never ends. You wake up in the morning and the thinking starts immediately. Before you even open your eyes, your mind is already several steps ahead. What do I need to do today? Did I say something wrong yesterday? Why did that person look at me that way? What if this thing goes wrong? You shower, but you're not really present in the shower. You're replaying conversations, planning responses to things that haven't been said yet, worrying about outcomes that haven't happened. You go to work, and on the surface you're functioning perfectly. But beneath that surface, there's a constant hum of mental activity. You're noticing everything. The tone of your boss's email, the way your coworker paused before answering your question, the tension in a meeting that maybe no one else felt. And all of it gets filed away. All of it gets analyzed. All of it becomes data that feeds the endless loop of trying to figure out if you're safe, if you're okay, if you're enough. You might find yourself unable to enjoy good moments because you're already thinking about when they'll end. You might struggle with decision-making not because you lack intelligence, but because you can see too many possibilities, too many outcomes, too many ways things could go wrong. You might have trouble sleeping because nighttime is when the thinking gets loudest, when the distractions disappear and you're left alone with your mind, and your mind has so much to say. You might notice that you're always preparing, always planning, always trying to control variables that can be controlled. And here's the cruelest part. You might feel guilty about it. You might look at other people who seem to move through life with ease, who make decisions quickly, who don't appear to be carrying the weight of constant analysis, and you might think something is wrong with you. You might wonder why you can't just relax, why you can't just be present, why you can't just turn it off. But here's the truth. You're not broken. You're not defective. Your brain is doing exactly what it learned to do. It's trying to protect you. The problem is that it's using an outdated strategy for a present that might not require it anymore. Think about this. Most people who want to stop thinking developed this pattern during a time in their life when they actually did need to be hypervigilant, when their environment genuinely was unpredictable or unsafe. A child who grows up with an alcoholic parent learns to read the room obsessively because their safety depends on it. A child who experiences neglect learns to be self-sufficient and overprepared because no one else is coming to help. A child who is criticized constantly learns to anticipate criticism and perfect their performance before anyone can find fault. These adaptations make sense. They're intelligent responses to difficult circumstances. But here's what happens. Time passes, circumstances change. You grow up, you leave that environment, you build a different life. But your brain doesn't always get the memo. It keeps running the same program because that program kept you alive. That program kept you safe. And so you continue to overthink, continue to analyze, continue to prepare for threats that aren't there anymore. Not because you're anxious or neurotic, but because your nervous system is still waiting for the other shoe to drop. In relationships, this manifests in painful ways. You might find yourself constantly checking in with your partner, not because you don't trust them, but because you need reassurance that everything is okay, that they're not upset, that you haven't done something wrong. You might overanalyze their texts, their tone, the time it takes them to respond. You might create problems in your mind that don't exist in reality, and then respond to those imagined problems, which creates actual conflict. You might struggle to be vulnerable because vulnerability requires letting go of control, and letting go of control feels terrifying. You might intellectualize emotions instead of feeling them because thinking about feelings is safer than experiencing them. And your partner, if they're not someone who operates this way, might not understand. They might say things like, "You're overthinking this," or "just relax," or "Why do you always assume the worst?" And those words, though often well-intentioned, feel like confirmation that something is wrong with you, that you're too much, that your mind is a burden. Friendships suffer too, though in quieter ways. You might find yourself being the person who always initiates plans because waiting for others to reach out feels like a test you're afraid to fail. You might struggle to believe that people genuinely enjoy your company, so you're always performing, always being the helpful one, the funny one, the one who makes things easy for everyone else. You might keep conversations light because going deep means revealing how much you actually think, and you worry that if people knew how much mental energy you expend on everything, they'd find you exhausting. You might have trouble accepting compliments because your mind immediately searches for hidden meanings or ulterior motives. And you might have a small circle of close friends, not because you're antisocial, but because maintaining relationships requires so much mental energy when you're constantly analyzing, interpreting, and trying to make sure everything is okay. At work, you might be the person who excels because you prepare obsessively. You think through every scenario. You anticipate problems before they arise. You deliver more than what's expected because doing enough never feels like enough. But you also might struggle with imposter syndrome because no matter how well you perform, no matter how much you achieve, there's always a voice in your head saying you could have done better. You missed something. You're about to be found out. You might have trouble delegating because you couldn't stop thinking about all the ways someone else might mess it up. You might work yourself to exhaustion because rest feels like neglect, like you're letting something slip, like disaster is always one moment of inattention away. And when people praise your work ethic, when they call you dedicated or detail-oriented, you smile and say thank you. But inside, you know it's not dedication, it's fear. It's the same pattern that's been running since childhood. The pattern that says, if I think hard enough, if I prepare well enough, if I control carefully enough, I'll be safe. Here's where it gets interesting though. There's a particular kind of thinking that happens when you can't stop thinking. It's not just random noise. It's not just anxiety bouncing around your skull. There's structure to it. There's purpose. Carl Jung understood this. He wrote about what he called active imagination, the mind's tendency to create narratives, to find patterns, to make meaning out of chaos. For people who can't stop thinking, this process is perpetual. Your mind is constantly constructing and deconstructing reality. You're not just thinking about what happened. You're thinking about what it means. You're thinking about the layers beneath the surface. You're thinking about how this moment connects to other moments, how this feeling relates to older feelings, how this pattern is the same pattern you've seen before. And in some ways this is a gift. People who think deeply often see things others miss. They're intuitive, empathetic. They understand complexity. They recognize that nothing is ever just one thing, but the cost is high. Because when you see everything, when you feel everything, when you're constantly making connections and finding meanings, there's no off switch, there's no break. Your mind becomes both your greatest strength and your heaviest burden. Jung also spoke about the shadow of the parts of ourselves we reject or hide because they don't fit the image we want to project. For chronic overthinkers, the shadow often contains the very things they're trying to think their way out of. Fear, vulnerability, the desperate need to be loved and accepted, the terror of being abandoned or rejected, the shame of not being enough. So instead of feeling these things, they think about them, they analyze them, They try to understand them intellectually because understanding feels like control. But here's the paradox Jung identified. The more you try to control something through thought, the more power it has over you. The shadow doesn't disappear because you think about it. It disappears when you acknowledge it, when you turn toward it, when you stop running. And for people who can't stop thinking, this is the most terrifying instruction imaginable. Stop thinking. Stop analyzing. Stop trying to figure it out. That feels like jumping off a cliff. That feels like choosing chaos over order. That feels like the very thing that kept them safe is being taken away. But there's another truth underneath all of this. A truth that's both painful and liberating. You can't think your way into safety. You can't analyze your way into love. You can't prepare enough, control enough, understand enough to guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen. Life is uncertain. People are unpredictable. Pain is inevitable. And no amount of thinking will change that. This realization is devastating at first, because it means the strategy you've been using your entire life, the strategy that required so much energy and effort and sacrifice, doesn't actually work. It never worked. It just felt like it did because thinking gave you something to do with your fear. It gave you the illusion of control. It made you feel like you were doing something productive with your anxiety instead of just sitting with it. But sitting with it, that's actually the answer. Not thinking more, not trying harder to figure it out, but learning to exist in uncertainty without immediately rushing to analysis. Learning to feel discomfort without immediately trying to solve it. Learning that you are not your thoughts, that you are the space in which thoughts occur, that you can observe your mind without being consumed by it. This is where healing begins. Not with understanding why you think so much, though that matters, but with practicing something radical: stillness. Not the forced stillness of meditation apps that tell you to clear your mind, but the gentle stillness of witnessing, of noticing when your mind starts racing and not judging it, not fighting it, not trying to think your way out of thinking, just noticing. Oh, there it is again. There's the fear, there's the need for control, there's the old pattern, and instead of engaging with it, instead of following it down the rabbit hole, you just sit with it. You let it be there without letting it take over. This practice is brutally hard at first. Your brain will resist. It will tell you that stillness is dangerous, that you need to keep thinking, that something bad will happen if you let your guard down. But slowly, gradually, through repeated practice, something shifts. You start to notice that the world doesn't fall apart when you stop thinking so hard, that people don't abandon you when you're not performing perfectly, that you can make mistakes and survive them, that uncertainty is uncomfortable but not fatal. You also begin to recognize something profound. The thinking was never really about solving problems. It was about avoiding feelings. Every time a difficult emotion started to surface, fear, sadness, anger, Shamu would think instead. You would analyze the emotion, understand where it came from, figure out what it meant, create a narrative around it, but you wouldn't actually feel it. And emotions don't go away because you think about them. They go away because you feel them. They move through you. They complete their cycle. But when you block them with thought, when you intellectualize instead of experience, they stay lodged in your body, in your nervous system, waiting. And so you have to think more, analyze more, control more, because there's this backlog of unfelt feelings that your mind is desperately trying to manage through cognition alone. Healing, then, requires something counterintuitive. It requires less thinking and more feeling. It requires turning toward the discomfort instead of away from it. It requires learning that emotions, no matter how intense, are temporary. They rise, they peak, they fall, but only if you let them move. And here's what nobody tells you about this process. As you learn to think less obsessively, as you learn to be present instead of perpetually planning or analyzing, you don't lose your intelligence. You don't become less capable. You don't suddenly become naive or unprepared. You actually become more effective. Because thinking is most powerful when it's intentional, when it's focused, when it's not just a compulsive response to anxiety. When you're not using all your mental energy on hypothetical scenarios and worst-case planning, you have that energy available for creativity, for connection, for actually experiencing your life instead of just preparing for it. You become someone who can still think deeply when needed, but who also knows how to rest, who can analyze when it's useful, but who doesn't use analysis as a shield against feeling, who can prepare without over-preparing, who can care without obsessing, who can love without constantly checking to make sure they're doing it right. The people in your life will notice the shift too. Your relationships become easier because you're not constantly in your head, not constantly second-guessing, not constantly seeking reassurance. You become more present, more relaxed, or able to just be with someone without simultaneously running a dozen mental simulations about the relationship. And paradoxically, this is when real intimacy becomes possible. Because intimacy requires presence, it requires vulnerability, it requires showing up as you are, not as the carefully controlled version of yourself that your mind has been constructing. It requires trusting that you're enough without needing to think your way into being enough. And for someone who has spent their entire life believing that thinking equals safety, that preparation equals love, that control equals security, this is the hardest and most liberating thing they'll ever do. So if you're someone who can't stop thinking, I want you to know this. Your mind is not your enemy. The thinking served a purpose. It kept you safe when you needed safety. It helped you navigate environments that required hypervigilance. It made sense. It was intelligent. It was survival. But you're not in that place anymore. You're here now. And here, you have a choice. You can continue running the same program. Continue exhausting yourself with endless analysis and preparation and control. Continue believing that if you just think hard enough, you can prevent pain. Or you can try something different. You can practice stillness. You can learn to witness your thoughts without believing them, without following them, without letting them dictate your entire experience of reality. You can learn to feel instead of think, to be instead of do, to rest instead of prepare. This won't happen overnight. You're just someone who learned a strategy that worked once, and now you're learning a new one. You're unlearning hypervigilance. You're unbecoming the version of yourself that believed thinking could save you. And in that unbecoming, you're discovering something extraordinary. That you were always safe. That you were always enough. That you never needed to think your way into deserving love or belonging or peace. Those things were already yours. You just couldn't see them through all the noise. But now, as the thinking quiets, as the mind settles, as you learn to simply be, you're finally seeing clearly. And what you're seeing is this. You don't need to figure everything out. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to be perpetually prepared for disaster. You just need to be here, present, breathing, alive. And that, all by itself, is enough.